Hello everyone, my name is Stephanie Boozer with CUGC HQ, and I'd like to welcome you to today's user share with the networking SIG. I'm going to be talking about cloud services and cloud-based federation. Our presentation today will be two parts. We'll have two presenters with some live Q&A discussion. I'd like to remind you to type your questions into the question area of the GoToWebinar control panel, and we will get to those during the presentation. Also let you know that this session is being recorded and will be available on mycugc.org within the next couple of days. And our presenters today are two of our networking SIG leaders, David Brett and Jason Samuel. I'll let them come on and say a little bit about themselves. We unfortunately don't have Marius today. He is down with the flu. But Dave, I'll turn things over to you and let you get started.
Just let me know when you can see my screen, Stephanie.
Sending it to you right now. There it is. I see it.
See it?
Yep.
Awesome. So thanks. Welcome to the third networking SIG webinar that we've run. Just a little bit about what we are going to cover today and with Marius at a later date. I'm going to run through some intros, then I'm going to talk about NetScaler federated authentication and Google Oauth as a service to log into your apps and desktops. Jason's going to run through some NetScaler ADFS and Azure Mfa. Marius is going to record and send out the Gateway as a service and some NetScaler and Microsoft Intune integration. So as I said, my name's Dave Brett. I'm based in Liphook in the UK. I'm recently a Citrix CTP, CUGC networking SIG leader and a community contributor on the abcc.com. And I've been working with NetScaler since about 2007. You can find me on Twitter at dbretty or my blog at bretty.me.uk.
Hi everyone, my name is Jason Samuel. I'm based out of Houston, Texas, and I am a Citrix CTP, an Atlantis ACE. I'm one of the leaders of the CUGC networking SIG, as well as the local Houston group, and I'm also a contributor on dabcc.com. I've been working with NetScaler since 2006, and my website info, my Twitter info are to the right if you feel like reaching out to me.
Marius, who can't be with us today, he's from Oslo in Norway. He's also recently been awarded a CTP along with other numerous accreditations that you can see there. He's a big NetScaler man, and you can see his Twitter and blog on the right there. But unfortunately today he is down with man flu, so we are planning on getting him to record his parts of this webinar, and when the recording goes out, we'll send both bits out so you'll get all of the information.
So one thing that we wanted to talk about was that the networking SIG actually won an award recently. It's a CUGC award for best content. This SIG has the most membership, has a lot of community interaction through the blogs and forum posts, and we've been doing these webinars. A lot of users have stepped forward and started sharing stuff. So for that reason, the SIG was given this award, and so congratulations to all of you. Everyone in the SIG is what makes it so good.
So moving on with the first bit of what we're going to go through today, I want to talk about NetScaler, Google, and federated authentication as a method of getting to your apps and desktops. So just what I'm going to cover today, one is why Google, why I picked Google as an Oauth provider, what we want to achieve with a config, and rather than do a description about what it is and some of the pitfalls and stuff like that, I thought I'd rather walk you through actually building a config of this. So I'm going to step through each bit that you need, how you deploy it, some of the things you need to look out for, and then at the end I'll demo it. When the slide deck goes out, there'll be links to blog articles on CUGC that detail each procedure that you need to follow. So if you do want to build this out in your own environment or in a lab and have a run with it and see how it goes, then you'll be able to do that after this webinar. Going to run through some prereqs that you need in place to do it, how to configure Google as your OAuth provider, the federated authentication, NetScaler configuration, storefront, and just demo it. So moving on to why I picked Google. It started last year with Synergy. I was chatting to a fellow CTP about using Google to authenticate to your apps and desktops. With the then release of federating services, was the Citrix Federated Authentication, or FAS, is now possible. So I started digging into it and wrote some sort of a few blogs about it. And then if you fast forward to the end of the year, I was approached by Rick Dellinger to assist in a project that he's running called Silverton HCL. If you want to read a little bit about what it is and what it involves, there'll be a link on the slide deck. But essentially, he wanted to create a Citrix Summit lab that Google were running to showcase a Chromebook and Citrix in a workspace. So as part of this, I was granted access to the Silverton HC lab and started to build out the environment. Rick asked me to build it as close to production strength as I could. And this was then delivered into the hands-on labs at Summit. And that's how this all came about. There's been a lot of questions asked since then and a lot of feedback on it. So I figured it's something that people kind of want to know about and want to play with and see what it can do for them. One of the other things at the hands-on lab, I think Google were giving away a free Chromebook, which I believe Jason managed to get hold of one. So that's pretty good. Just talking about what we're trying to achieve with this build. So essentially we want two ways of accessing a unified gateway. You want regular access where people can type in a URL. Incidentally, for the rest of this part of the presentation, I'm going to use the Chrome Summit build as a template for all the URLs and everything else that goes around this. So you want a normal URL that just provides LDAP access to your apps and desktops. On top of that, going into the same unified gateway, you want a separate URL that will get filtered off to a Google OAuth provider. That will then authenticate you with your NetScaler and pass you through to your apps and desktops. As part of this, we also want to make sure we filter out receiver access to the Google URL, so we don't get errors with the login procedure, and it's only web forms that gets passed over. So moving on to the prereqs that you need before you build this out. Some of it's quite obvious, and some of it not so much. The kind of obvious one is you need a working domain and a Citrix estate, so 7.9 at least, up and running with a domain and everything going as it should. Also, a wizard-built Citrix Unified Gateway. You don't necessarily need this. You can do it with a regular NetScaler gateway, but with the method that I'm showing here, using a content switch to front all this, you need a non-addressable vServer and some regular load balancers and AAA servers behind it. So a single entry point and a single public IP, you would use Unified Gateway. The examples that I've given here, the Unified Gateway was built just using the standard wizard. DNS NAT and firewall, so you obviously need to be allowing in to your internal network the correct ports, namely 443 and 80 from the external internet. You need some public IPs or a single public IP, and that needs to be NATed through to your internal content switch. And at minimum, you need 2 DNS records. In this example, I'm going to be using citrix.chromesummit.com, and that's going to be used for standard LDAP authentication into your apps and desktops. And then login.chromesummit.com, that's going to use the Google OAuth provider and authenticate you with your Google account and then send you through to your apps and desktops. You need to add and decide on a Google UPN that you're going to add as an additional UPN on your domain, so your AD users can authenticate with your Google email address. And some nice to haves. So as part of the Silverton build, because it was trying to be as close to production, some nice to haves that you don't need to make this work, but will make it more robust. There's stuff like storefront load balancers, LDAP load balancers, brokering ticketing. All your SSL entry points need to be hardened and built to best practice. There's hundreds of stuff. Anton's written a good blog on hardening your gateways to get an A+ from SSL Labs. So then moving on to Google, the first thing you want to do when you're doing this is set up a Oauth credential client ID and a provider. This is all you need to do from the Google side to get this working, and the rest is done in-house and on your Citrix platform with your NetScaler. So if you head over to the URL there, console.developers.google.com and then /APIs. When you log on, you'll get the API manager on the left. If you go down to credentials, you're going to create some Oauth client credentials to allow your NetScaler to talk to your Google Oauth provider. Before you try and add the credentials or the Oauth client ID, you need to fill out the Oauth Consent screen. It's literally a name and a description, and then it will allow you to create your client ID. When creating it, you're going to have to give it a name, and this is just a descriptive name so that you can edit and get back to these client IDs further down the line if you want. And then it's going to ask you for a origin URL and a redirect. So the first one for the JavaScript origins is the full FQDN that you're going to use for your Google Oauth login point. In this case, it's https://login.chromesummit.com. And then the redirect URI is the same, but with /Oauth/login on the end. You can see those listed there. Once you filled that out, you'll click Create, and Google is going to give back to you a client ID and a client secret. It's a big, long, encrypted text line. You need to copy these off, put them in a text file and save them somewhere, because you will need them later when you're setting up the Oauth profile on the NetScaler. And that's it. Once you've got that in Google, then that's kind of all you have to do on that side of things to configure it. The next is Citrix Federated Authentication. Now, this is FAS for short. It's referred to a lot, and it's a component that allows certificate-based auth into your Citrix apps and desktops and storefront. It's a pretty simple install. The URL I've put on the screen there is the official Citrix documentation on how to install it. I'm not going to run through the entire install because they've done a great job of describing it, and Carl Starlid, who's on, I believe, today, has written a great blog article on installing Citrix FAS, and it is pretty straightforward. Once it's installed, you will need a internal certificate authority to get this working. So you request a certificate from the CA and then use the CA to issue that back to FAS, and then it's up and running and ready to go once you've configured a bit of security. Some of the things to look out for when you have built FAS. Within the group policy for federated authentication, make sure you enable the session certificates to prevent issues with authentication while reconnecting and disconnecting to your desktops. Also, make sure you run the storefront config, the PowerShell script that's in either Carl's blog or the official FAS documentation, and make sure you run that on all of your storefront servers. before you move on to the next step. So now moving on to the bit, and this is where most of the work's done in this case, with NetScaler. So the different steps here is kind of trying to, when this slide deck gets sent out, it'll break it down into the individual bits you need to do to get Google working through a single entry point into your network. We'll start with the Oauth policy. So this is where you're going to need the client ID and the client secret that you generated earlier, doing the Google Oauth API. You can find the policies you need under the security node, and then in basic authentication policies, then under Oauth. If you click to add a new Oauth action and then use the data that's listed on this slide to fill out the form that it presents, but just make sure where it says your client ID up there, you substitute your client ID that Google provided you, and also put in your client secret into that Oauth policy. Once you've created the Oauth action, then create a policy with that and just set the expression to true and bind the Oauth policy you created to it. Once you've done that, you need to move on to your AAA vServer. When you create your new AAA vServer, you bind the same certificate that's got the rights to authenticate SSL connections to the FQDN that you're providing for Google Oauth access to your apps and desktops. So it needs to be capable of assuring that login.chromesummit.com is a good URL. You need to give your AAA server a free IP address on your network and set it to port 443. And then once that's done, you go into the authentication policies and then select your Google Oauth policy that you created earlier and assign that as an advanced authentication policy against that AAA vServer. Moving on from that, once you've got your AAA vServer in place, we create a load balancing vServer. And the reason we do this is it acts as a pass-through from the unified gateway content switch and the AAA vServer. So again, standard, you create a load balancing vServer, give it an IP address, and then assign the same certificate to the load balancing vServer that you did to your AAA server. The only difference with this is with the services that you bind to the load balancing vServer is a always up service. So this is essentially a service that you'll create on the NetScaler. So if you were to create a new service and put a monitor against it, for this example, you'd do a ping monitor and ping the loopback address for the NetScaler itself. So that service, whilst that NetScaler is online, will never go down, and therefore the vServer will always be live. You add the authentication method to your new standard vServer, and when you do that, you select the authentication virtual server that you built, the AAA server, and for the FQDN, set auth.h.1. And then the last thing you need to do with this load balancing vServer is set a responder policy up to redirect you to your VPN entry point once you're handed back from Google. So Google, once you've authenticated with Google, will pass you back to this load balancing vServer. That's going to then hit the root with a 302 response code, and you need that to forward on to your login.chromesummit.com/citrix/index.html, I think it is. Again, when this goes out, the script to build all of this will be in place. Something worth checking. So once you've created your AAA vServer and your load balancing vServer, just open up your AAA server, vServer, and check that your virtual server that you've just created is set as a forms-based virtual server for authentication against that. It should already have been done, but a couple of times I've built this out, that's been missing and I've had to add that manually. So if we move on to the content switching policy, effectively at the minute we built a vServer that links to a AAA vServer that asks Google to authenticate you. Now, what we're doing now is telling the NetScaler with that single unified gateway entry point where to direct traffic as it comes in and hits that unified gateway. So what we're effectively after is if somebody types in citrix.chromesummit.com, or if that traffic is authenticated, then we want to pass them over to our NetScaler Gateway, the non-addressable NetScaler Gateway that would have been built as part of the Unified Gateway Wizard. And if somebody types in login.chromesummit.com, we want to pass them over to our load balancing virtual server that is acting as a pass-through for our AAA vServer. The way to do this, if we create a content switching action to send the users to our NetScaler Gateway virtual server, and you can see that on the right there. This is just when you go into content switching, go to actions, click add, give it a name, select the gateway virtual server, and from the drop down pick the gateway that's been built as part of your unified gateway. Then we need to create a policy that we use to enact that action, and the policy text that you need to enter for the query is written up there, and it's basically saying if any of the if in the URL you've got /cvpn/citrix, any of the AAA authentication or the base URL for your standard NetScaler Gateway, pass them over to that. Once that's done, you need to open up your content switch for your unified gateway and bind your content switching policy as priority 100 to that content switch. Once you've done that, right below that on the config screen there is a default virtual server for the content switch, and if you set that to your Chrome AAA, not the AAA, sorry, the Chrome load balancing virtual server, then anything that isn't authenticated or directly going to your standard NetScaler Gateway will be redirected to the Chrome load balancer, which in turn will hand you off to Google for authentication. Once you've got the traffic sorted out inbound so the users are going to the right places, you need to have a look at your policies that are assigned to your NetScaler Gateway. One of the first things you want to do is open up the web policy that's assigned during the Unified Gateway Wizard and untick and remove the single sign-on domain, because that's going to come from the Google Oauth provider and be handed over to your NetScaler Gateway. One of the other things I found whilst doing this is that there were issues with authenticating you using Google Oauth if you were already signed into Google and with the expression for the header, the HTTP referrer header, and the not using native Citrix receiver. A way around this is to put a fallback policy in place so that if it doesn't hit the native receiver or the web policy, then it will default to your fallback policy. The way I did this is take the web policy once I've removed the single sign-on domain and replicate that and create a fallback policy and use ns_true and then bind that to the NetScaler Gateway as priority 1000. So if you miss any of the other two, it's going to hit that as a default policy. Another thing is login once. You need to make sure this is ticked on the gateway. Otherwise, the SSO back to your NetScaler Gateway won't happen properly once you've been authenticated with Google. And finally, the one thing we were looking at is using Citrix receiver, the native receiver, to access the Silverton lab. And it was working fine when you were using the citrix.chromesummit.com, which is the standard LDAP entry point. But when they were typing in the login.chromesummit.com URL, it was blowing up and just not working nicely. So what we did is we put some content switching policies bound as a priority 90, so it hit that before it got to the one we did for the standard NetScaler Gateway. And for the expression, we just identified if the host name was login.chromesummit.com and the user agent header contained Citrix receiver. So if they were trying to log into chromesummit.com and they were using the native receiver, then we handed them off to the standard LDAP authentication process rather than trying to authenticate them with Google. And the final piece is storefront. Once you've built your NetScalers, once you've set up your Google Oauth policy and got all your FASs built and configured, the last bit to do is storefront and make sure that that can handle inbound connections from both FQDNs and also handle authentication from FAS. So what you need to do, you need to make sure in your NetScaler gateways you've got both URLs defined as a valid NetScaler gateway for the store, and you need a callback address in both of those for it to work properly. You need to define remote access to your store and allow access into that store from both Citrix and login.chromesummit.com. Make sure that both of your entry point URLs are defined as external beacons on the store. You need to enable smart card authentication into the store. Make sure you fully delegate the credential validation to the NetScalers. And finally, make sure that you've enabled smart card authentication on the receiver for web store that you created to handle this this login process. Once that's done, everything should be working as expected. So these are the 6 things you need to make sure you do. Once that, make sure you replicate that across your storefront server group if you're using a NetScaler load balancer or any other load balancing method to direct users over one or more stores. And then this is a demo of it working in practice. Browser that isn't signed into Google. So if we hit the login.chromesummit.com, that's hit our AAAV server, handed us off to Google for authentication. We then sign in, and that passes us back to that V server, which in turn forwards us to our NetScaler Gateway and allows us to log in and launch desktops from storefront using our Google credentials. Finally, we're looking at a browser that's already logged into Google. So most Chromebooks, when you log in, you'll have to sign in with a Google account. You type in the URL, that passes you to Google. You're already authenticated, and then SSOs you straight onto storefront. And then you can launch your desktop from there using your Google account. and that's a walkthrough of how to set up NetScaler, Citrix Federated Authentication, and Google for access to your apps and desktops. Like I said earlier, when the slide deck goes out, there'll be details in the slide deck about how to configure this. I'll also get the URLs for the CUGC community roundtable posts, which will go through this process in much more detail, and you can try and build this out and see how it works in your own lab. And with that, I will hand you over to Jason to do some SAML and NetScaler.
Can we just take a couple of questions really quickly?
Yeah.
I just had a couple. So one from Justin asked, what would be a use case for authenticating via Google and getting an internal desktop?
So the use case we used for the Silverton HCL was using Google Chromebooks. So if you get a Chromebook, you can set the user, let them use the device as their own, and configure. They'll always be logged into that with their Google account. So they bring that in, they type in the unified gateway URL, and they get seamless SSO into their apps and desktops. You don't necessarily need to give them a full desktop. If you've got some corporate line of business apps that you want to gain access to, you can do that using this method.
Okay, and Jacob says vendor accounts is also a really good use case. That way you don't have to manage the vendor user's credentials.
Thanks, Jake.
And then there was one other question that was from earlier on, so it might be out of context a little bit at this point, but it was, can the FAS be highly available now? And I think that was before you went into your Google Oauth Policy slide.
Yeah, I mean, the FAS build that we did in Silverton certainly had two servers behind it, and you log in and you could get to both.
Okay, well, that's all for questions for now. So, Jason, you ready for me to send you the screen?
Yes, go for it.
Okay, very good.
All right, you should be able to see my screen now.
Yes, we can.
All right, so let's get into it. I'm going to be covering NetScaler, ADFS, and Azure MFA today. So first, let me go over what ADFS is. ADFS stands for Active Directory Federation Services. You'll see it spelled AD space FS or ADFS all as one word. It's the same thing. Microsoft tends to spell it with the space, while users end up just spelling it with ADFS. So both ways are really correct. I tend to try and spell it the Microsoft way when I can. But fundamentally what it is, it allows a web app to be able to talk to another company's AD or to the cloud for a single sign-on. Traditionally it's been that, but in reality you can actually use ADFS to make internal authentication better as well using integrated Windows authentication. So why is it important? Well, these days security is first and foremost. We kind of heard Citrix talk about that at Summit from some of the announcements, but for most enterprises, security is one of the biggest things right now. It is one of the biggest priorities in 2017 for many CIOs. So one of the things that they will go and tell their teams is that they want some kind of identity management in place, identity and access management, one single user ID for a user to be able to access everything they have access to. And then when that user leaves the company or whatever happens, when you disable that one account, all these other resources they have access to also get disabled. ADFS itself is just a server role. It's installed on Windows Server OSs. The most common one that I see is ADFS 3.0, which is what shipped with Windows Server 2012 R2. And that's what we're going to show you some demos on a little bit later. I have been trying ADFS 4.0, which shipped with Server 2016. Server 2016 is not even 4 months old right now, and there's additional pieces that are coming into play. But it's something I was working on in my lab in order to do this demo, and I kind of ran into a couple of issues. So I didn't have that ready for this particular lab. So the demos are all going to be on ADFS 3.0 going forward, and that is again one of the most common production deployments that I do see. So what is ADFS? ADFS is basically a SAML identity provider. It's also a security token service that uses SAML claims. So essentially, what we're seeing is that many people refer to ADFS as STS or ADFS. What Dave and I were kind of talking about is in the UK, it seems that most people call it sts.yourdomain.com, whereas in the US, what I'm seeing is more adfs.yourdomain.com. But at the end of the day, it's the same thing. The most common use cases for ADFS are going to be hybrid cloud and mobility SaaS use cases. What I see it being used for the most is Office 365. I have used it for ShareFile before, what we're going to show you today is how to use it for NetScaler Gateway logins. The beauty of it all is that if users are used to using single sign-on through Office 365, they can access everything else exactly the same way, including XenApp and XenDesktop. So I want to explain how claims-based authentication works. Normally, when I log into a web app, I log in with an Active Directory user ID and password, and it's up to the web app to be able to figure out, how to pass this credential to AD, perform the validation. There has to be logic within the web application. That's one of the biggest problems. But when the web app is in the cloud, then you have a whole other list of issues, which is that particular cloud service would have to maintain a list of users and passwords separately from my on-premises Active Directory. This list has to always be maintained. It has to be up to date. When people leave the company, they have to be disabled. Otherwise, somebody could leave the company. You leave the on-premises AD account disabled, or you go in and disable it. But then this cloud service that they had access to, everybody forgets about that one, and so the user can still log in and get access to company-related information. So that is a big security concern. And the last big problem with traditional login methods is that every web app I hit requires me to log in, and nothing is really aware of each other. So it's a really bad user experience because I'm constantly having to remember credentials and have to log into each one of these individually throughout the day. So really, how claims-based authentication works, and I have a diagram here at the bottom, is imagine like if you were a user here and you wanted to access something like, for example, NetScaler Gateway, and you wanted to access a resource. In this case, my claim, which is my user ID, my password, everything gets passed to a third party as opposed to a Active Directory directly. And in this case, the SAML IDP here is actually a ADFS, but you can also use the NetScaler as a SAML identity provider as well, which I have used before and it works great. But in the purposes of this demo, we're going to call the SAML IDP our ADFS box. So what happens is that the communication goes here over a secure token, and then from there, the user gets directed to the SAML identity provider's login page. From here, the credentials are passed into the SAML identity provider. The credentials are sent to Active Directory by the identity provider, and it sends back a verification response to ADFS, the SAML identity provider. Before it actually talks back to the service provider, it again encapsulates it in a token along with the response. So now this token can be used here by the service provider for pretty much anything that the user accesses through that service provider. And what I've just described is basically single sign-on. And the open standard around this particular claims-based authentication is called SAML, Security Assertion Markup Language, and that is fundamentally what ADFS is using. So Switching gears just a little bit, when you talk about ADFS for enterprise, you also have to kind of talk about Azure AD and AD Connect, very, very common things. So Azure AD, also known as AAD, is an extension of your on-premises Active Directory to Azure, giving users a single identity. It actually comes in 4 different flavors. So I've seen a lot of enterprises that jump into Office 365 first, and they don't realize it, but what you're using in order to get your users synced and using Office 365 is actually a flavor that's called of Azure AD Free. And with this particular tier, you don't get a whole lot of extra features, but when you start paying for Azure AD, the more advanced subscriptions such as Basic or Premium 1 or Premium 2, you get more features around syncing, back and forth. You get a lot of security features like Azure Mfa. You get a lot of identity and access management, a lot of visibility into a lot of the security pieces. So that's what the additional tiers are. Now, the other piece I want to talk about is AD Connect. AD Connect is a syncing mechanism for the AD users and groups from your data center to Azure AD. It's just a little piece that you install, and with Server 2016, actually, if you are trying Server 2016, I believe AD Connect was released for that with full support in December, so just a couple months ago. But that's something if you want to try it. But what I see in production is a lot of people have AD Connect running on Server 2012, and it's syncs the user groups up into Azure. Now, there are a couple different ways that you can handle syncing. If you do the express settings, what it's going to do by default is going to send the password hash into Azure. And what that does is it allows you to be able to use that password both inside Azure for like password resets and stuff, as long as you do password write back and a few other things based on your subscription level. But it allows a little bit more flexibility, and that is kind of the way that Microsoft wants you to do it. And of course, on-premises AD will still be the authority. But a lot of organizations, they don't want to have anything around password being synced into the cloud in any shape or form, even when it's hashed. So AD Connect has the ability to disable the password syncing, but what this means is that anytime anybody needs to access a resource in the cloud, everything has to be validated by ADFS, which is on premises, and that's what gets the user in. So here I have a little diagram of how the password hash sync works. Right here in the center, you can see that on premises we have the users, and there's AD Connect syncing it into Azure. When we don't do the password sync, then we have to actually stand up ADFS servers on premises, and that's what does the credential validation. But AD Connect is still running, syncing everything else. So the next thing I want to talk about is Azure MFA, which is Azure Multi-Factor Authentication. So this is an optional piece, but in my opinion, every enterprise should be looking into having some kind of multi-factor authentication in place if you don't have it already. What this allows for is an additional method of authentication through either a phone call, an SMS text message, a push notification from the mobile app, or even Oauth tokens if you need to, if you have some other more legacy type use cases. But it's just an additional factor of authentication that you can have for your users besides just user ID and password. Azure MFA actually comes in 3 different flavors. There is the one that you can enable in Office 365. There's one for Azure admin accounts, so any administration type accounts, they are protected. And the last one, which is the one that we're going to be more focused on, is going to be the cloud and or on-premises one, the on-premises one being kind of a hybrid model that gives you, in my opinion, the most flexibility, because you can connect your on-premises appliances like the NetScaler Gateway or any VPN type appliances, whatever you have, to it for authentication purposes. Now, with Server 2016 and ADFS 4.0, there is actually an Azure Mfa Adapter built into it. So for some use cases, you don't have to have on-prem MFA servers. I'm in the process of testing this. I don't believe that you can do like an LDAP bind or LDAP-S bind or use Radius against it just yet. But it's so you probably do still need on-prem MFA servers for that piece. But it's something that I am testing. I will do possibly like a write-up or something going forward. The other big news around Azure MFA is about 2 days ago, Azure MFA for Radius via a network policy server without the need for on-prem MFA servers went public preview. So what this means is that you don't have to have any on-prem MFA servers. You can do a NetScaler Radius authentication bind directly to the NPS server. I don't really see what it would save you because an on-prem MFA server is very, very flexible. You would still have to stand up NPS servers if you don't have them already, but it's definitely something I would test if you wanted to go that route. Again, it's public preview, so please don't use it for any type of production type scenario. So how does the NetScaler fit into all this? Well, NetScaler can use a SAML authentication policy instead of the traditional LDAP or LDAP-S or Radius authentication policy to your ADFS server, and this will give you integrated Windows authentication SSO. You can also do SSL offloading and load balancing of your ADFS proxy servers in the DMZ with NetScaler, or even have the NetScaler itself be an ADFS proxy without the need for those WAP proxy servers out there. And that's what we're going to actually show you a little bit later in the demo. NetScaler can use the same SAML auth policy against an LB server acting as that ADFS proxy, as long as you have the necessary rewrite policies applied to it, and that's how you replace those servers completely. And then the next thing you can do is actually SSL offload and load balance of your ADFS servers internally as well, so you get a lot of benefits there. And then lastly, this is kind of important, MFA is invoked by the ADFS server as part of the SAML auth. Usually when you deploy MFA, it's actually part of the authentication process. You're authenticating against the MFA server, and that is what makes the phone call. But in this case, it's ADFS that's going to have the intelligence that we're going to build the intelligence around, and ADFS is the one that's going to be making the phone call. So one thing that I want to talk about when you're setting up ADFS is around certificates. SAML is a very, very certificate-centric technology, right? Everything is certificate-based. So what I would recommend is on public certificates, you should use public certificates for external-facing stuff like the services communication. Production environments should use a regular cert if at all possible. If you really have a need for multi-domain for whatever reason, use a subject alternative name cert, a SAN cert. But I highly recommend you don't use wildcard certs in production. The reason being, I have seen wildcard certs where they just kind of proliferate throughout the environment. People like to have things easy, so they have a wildcard cert that will expire in like 5 years or something, and it's bought to use a couple different things, and then all of a sudden, some developer or somebody gets hold of it and it gets baked into some other applications, and then when it comes time for expiration, you're frantically trying to figure out, where all this wildcard is being used. And you forget, and then all of a sudden some middle tier app that was using it causes you to have an outage in your company. So for this reason, and also for the fact that if you're ever compromised and you had to revoke that wildcard cert, you're talking about a massive undertaking by your IT staff in order to replace that cert, and you're talking about possible outages there as well. There's also impersonation issues, so like if somebody were to compromise your private keys, they could stand up whatever. So for these reasons, I really don't recommend wildcards for pretty much anything in production. When it comes to the token decrypting and token signing certs, by default, ADFS creates self-signed certs for these. And they do, by default, expire in 1 year. And you can change this with PowerShell. But every time you update this, you have to update the relaying parties, which in this case would be NetScaler, or if you're using ShareFile, you have to go update that cert in the control plane. And if you let it expire, then you're talking about a possible outage for one of your services. So it's very easy to get into the mindset of, hey, let's make it easy and just use the same cert everywhere. But that kind of has some security implications around SAML. And then secondly, you lose a little bit of control. I think with token decrypting and token signing certs, if you keep it self-signed, you have complete control over this. And in my opinion, it encourages better lifecycle practices, PKI type lifecycle practices around SSL certs. You may not have a dedicated PKI team internally at your company, but you as a NetScaler engineer, your first thought is always going to be about security. So even if other people in your company may not have the same mindset, it's good for you to have that mindset and manage it. It's a little bit extra work on your behalf, but using things like NetScaler Mass or even Office 365, it can actually tell when a cert's about to expire. There's different ways for you to be able to manage and alert on these expirations, so that you don't get caught having an outage because you forgot about a cert. There is more advice on ADFS cert planning. Microsoft has a wonderful TechNet article about this, so the link is right there. It is a pretty involved deep dive, but it is full of very useful information, so I encourage you to review that. Now, with that said, if you do use a wildcard for like a testing purposes, like for a dev environment or a lab, the NetScaler has a feature called backend SNI, server name indication. It used to be that NetScaler would only be able to do front end, but with newer versions of NetScaler firmware, you can do backend SNI. So when you're talking about load balancing ADFS, if you go to the service or service group, you can actually go in there and flip on SNI enable under the SSL parameters and then pass the actual common name for your ADFS. In this example, I'm using adfs.company.com. What this will allow you to do is complete that SSL handshake, and so that you won't have that problem of it just sitting there and just kind of timing out otherwise. Now, the old way of fixing this was changing the cert bindings on the ADFS servers. The thing is that you would have to go to each and every one of your ADFS servers and do something like this. And there's a couple other techniques as well. But really, what I prefer now is just using the backend SNI feature of the NetScaler itself. So troubleshooting ADFS and Samlof on NetScaler, when it's just like troubleshooting anything else on a NetScaler, you can watch the policy hits, so with NSCon message, you can watch the AAA login as the users are logging in, and then of course you can tail the NS log. Historical lookups, you can do NSCon message against for stats. You can do actually go through the NS log, just kind of run through that as well. Additionally, I would highly recommend using something like NetScaler Mass, because it can do a lot of the syslogging. It has a lot of alerting features built in, or you can use even something like Splunk, which is another favorite of mine because of the way you can do searches and run your queries and so on. So now on to the actual demos. So as I said, I was working on Server 2016 and ADFS 4.0 in my environment. I couldn't quite get it to work. I ran into a couple of challenges, and I'm still working through that. But Dave actually had his lab up and running with this exact setup using ADFS 3.0 and Server 2012. So I actually took some videos from within his lab. So I'm going to start off by putting the unified gateway address here in the address bar. When I do put that in there, watch what happens. This is the internal user experience. You will see ADFS flash very briefly when I press enter. There it is. And immediately I have been single signed on into the NetScaler. I'm going to hit clientless access, and now I can access any of my applications just like I normally would. And I have been passed with my actual email address. So here I don't have any apps or desktops published to me, but you get the idea. And then secondly, so that's actually the internal user experience. Now secondly is the external user experience. What I have here is a Chrome web browser, because I'm going to pretend like I'm at home. And then I also have my cell phone here off to the side. I'm just casting it so that you can see how that works. So again, I'm going to take the same exact FQDN, that same unified gateway URL. I'm not changing it one bit. I'm putting that right into that title bar. And watch what happens this time when I press enter. ADFS stops me. It says, hey, I see that you're coming from outside, so I want you to put in your email address and your password here. This is a very similar experience to how Office 365 works. It's a very nice user experience, in my opinion. So now, as soon as I put my credentials in, it's now actually calling my cell phone. So on the left-hand side, you can see Azure Mfa is now calling me. I'm going to accept that phone call, and then I'm going to hit the pound button, just like the voice prompt is telling me to do. As soon as I do that, I get passed right on through to my NetScaler. And again, it's the same exact user experience as internal. I go into my clientless access, and now I can get into my applications and use them just like I could internally. And again, the email address has been passed. So I think it's a very nice user experience, and we do have to make fun of Dave a little bit because he is not using the RF Web UI. He's over here still using X1, but we'll mess with him a little bit later on that. But the beauty of this is that you now have an integrated Windows authentication ability internally while still using NetScaler Gateway, and I think that's very nice, because in the past there have been different ways to be able to use NetScaler Gateway internally for a variety of reasons, such as HTTP inside traffic, TCP optimizations that you can apply. And there's been ways of putting just a NetScaler Gateway internally with a single FQDN. There's Optimal Gateway. There's SOX proxy using LAN user mode. But now you have yet another way of getting around that. And I think going forward, this is something that I would want to test further and kind of compare against all these other ways of doing it. Further reading, so everything you just saw, those 2 videos that you just saw, that is from within Dave's lab, and he wrote a wonderful 6-part series on XenDesktop, ADFS, Azure Mfa, NetScaler, Unified Gateway, and FAS all together, how it all works together. And I've linked to the first part there, but if you actually click through, you can read all the parts that you just witnessed in those videos. The second thing I want to point out is Anton did a wonderful article on Azure AD as the identity provider. So instead of using ADFS, you can actually use Azure AD. Some people may not have the need to do ADFS. ADFS is typically used for more complex type environments, but if you're a greenfield deployment, you're a brand new company and you're just using Azure AD, then this is another way to be able to offer Citrix servers. So that's a great article. The third thing I want to point out is Carl did a wonderful FAST guide. I think Dave alluded to it a little bit earlier, but there's the link to it. As always, impeccable documentation from Carl on that, and it will walk you right through it. When you actually walk through it, it's not as hard as you would think it is. And then lastly, I wrote an article on Azure Mfa AD Connect and Azure AD Premium with NetScaler. It's a little bit dated now. I wrote it in 2015, but the funny thing is everything I talk about there is exactly how you would do it now in 2017 as well. I actually am doing far more Azure Mfa deployments than I ever thought I would, because security has become a top concern for so many companies now. So if you want to dive a little bit deeper into MFA itself, that would be there. And with that, I would have normally have passed it to Marius to cover a few things, but unfortunately both him and his slide deck are on quarantine right now due to the flu. So we will have hopefully a recording available later on that. And with that, are there any questions?
I think I've got to
yeah,
most
Dave,
of
you
them
got 'em?
in the chat.
Are there in the chat? I'm trying to pull it up here.
Yeah, I think I got most of them done. There's a couple of bits which we're going to come back, and I'll write a post and put it up on the networking SIG so that people can read the questions. Okay, excellent.
And then more things you should sign up for. There is the NetScaler Masterclass. It is the first week of every month. It's something that I try and attend pretty much every month, and I encourage you to as well. Even if you can't attend in person, please do sign up and they will send the recording out. Of course, there's the CUGC Networking SIG Forum, where you can talk with the PMs and your peers. It's a wonderful resource. And of course, for any support-related issues, definitely check out the NetScaler discussion forums as well as the NetScaler Gateway discussion forums. And that is the end of my presentation. Stephanie, if you want to take control.
All right. So thank you guys so much. You'll also see everyone in your chat window that there is a link to join the networking SIG if you haven't done it already, and a link to mycugc.org. We will be posting, I'll see, can I post a bunch of the resources that you've included in your slide deck, Jason and Dave? That would be great if I could do that in the forum.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
all right.
Yeah.
We'll make sure we get those out there, and if you guys have any other questions, you can post those in the networking forum on mycugc.org, and we'll make sure that they get answered. And just a couple other items of business for you. I'm about to put in the chat right now a link to our survey. We'd love for you to go ahead and fill it out. It's pretty short and it's anonymous, and it helps us, continue providing great webinar content for you. And with that, I'd like to thank Dave and Jason again, and we will hopefully hear from Marius soon. Hope he feels better, and we'll get his recording, and I'll make sure to make that available to you all as well. All right, so I hope everyone has a great day. Thanks so much.